Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Doug Howarth, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate you having me on your show.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from the LA area in California. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about hypernomics and improving our understanding of markets and decision-making processes. Really interesting topic. I'm excited to explore this idea of hypernomics with you. As we get started, I wanted to share Doug's bio with everybody. At 14, Doug Howarth was faced with a problem that would pursue him for decades. He had just been exposed to the 2D and 3D coordinate systems of René Descartes, and while they offered a framework for many problems, he wondered what other plotting systems existed that we hadn't yet seen. Shortly after, Doug found out that his kidneys were failing, and that clouded his thinking. Persevering through his challenges, he majored in economics at Washington State University, graduating top of his class, and in 2002, Doug's best friend gave him a kidney. When he came to after the operation, his brain was clear for the first time in 30 years, and he was determined to make maximum use of his improved mental capacity. Not long after that, when he and his wife went shopping for a new washing machine, as she weighed her options aloud, he realized that she had solved a multidimensional problem in her head. He instantly recognized that people throughout the store were subconsciously doing similar evaluations for all their considered purchases. In that moment, he discovered hypernomics, the study of market actions across 4 or more dimensions, the plotting system he had been wondering about for 3 decades. And so he founded Hypernomics Inc. on this idea. And this is really what we're going to be talking about and exploring together today. I'm going to pause there. Doug, anything you would like to highlight by way of your background further before we dive on in?
Well, the only other thing there, John, is that I had been also wondering about why programs typically fail when people start make a project and they try to run off and solve a new problem. Sometimes they fail for a whole variety of reasons, and I wanted to figure out if there was some missing math, and it turns out that hypernomics offers some of the missing math that describes why problems go awry. So that's an issue that this thing can solve.
Well, it's interesting. So this isn't directly related to what we're going to be talking about today, but just yesterday. So, it's a lazy Sunday afternoon and I'm sitting there on the couch and I'm just perusing on my phone, and I come across an article about string theory and about, how 2D, two-dimensional creatures can't perceive 3D, right? And how 3D creatures, we're 3D creatures, and how 3D creatures really struggle to perceive beyond 3 dimensions. But scientists and mathematicians, they've done the calculations and they say, no, there's really many more dimensions beyond what we can perceive, probably up to 11 or more dimensions, right? Perhaps many, many more dimensions. Anyways, it was just this kind of mind-bending kind of article, and I'm thinking about it, and it's just ironic, that today we're sitting down first thing on a Monday morning talking about getting past, the simple 2D, 3D approach to thinking about how we go about decision making in economics, because of course things are more complicated, than how we make things out to be in simple behavioral economics. You talk to an economist and they're going to say, of course, we make all these simplified assumptions about how people make decisions in their purchasing or whatever the case may be, economic decision making. All these assumptions are faulty. Like every economist is going to say that. Like the assumptions that we base all of these equations off of and all these things off of are not sound, yet they do that because that's what they have to do in order for for everything to work, right? And so it's interesting to start to think beyond that, to start to stretch ourselves in our considerations, to think beyond the 3D. So anyways, I'm excited to hear your thinking on this.
Yeah, so getting back to the whole washing machine scenario that I saw, I mean, my wife was looking at the washing machine and we the one at home had busted, and she goes, She saw a machine she liked. She goes, I like this machine, but it doesn't have as much. It's got more capacity than we have at home. I'd like to have more capacity. So I thought
Hmm.
capacity versus price.
Yeah.
They call it a 2D relationship.
Yeah.
Then we kept looking, and she says, I need more cycles. We only have one gentle cycle at home. And some of these machines will have up to 20 and 30 cycles. So I thought cycles versus price. That's another 2D relationship. And then I saw the next machine up the line. We liked this one, and I saw the next one up the line, and it had more cycles and more capacity, and it also cost more. And I said, well, what about this one? And she says, it costs too much. And I realized that, the one we were looking at, they were going to sell so many of this, but they were going to sell fewer of the one that was more expensive and still fewer of the most expensive one, and then more of the ones that had fewer features. And so that was a price versus quantity thing.
Hmm.
So she was looking at capacity, cycles, price, and quantity. And I realized in that second that was a four-dimensional problem. And so I raced home to figure out how to draw that. And I ended up having to buy a computational fluid dynamics program to be able to work that out. But it works out that if price is the single vertical axis for the people that like to know about that, like imagine a wall going up where at your house where two walls intersect, that line would be a vertical line. And it turns out that quantity versus that price that's a two-dimensional thing. And then my wife was looking at the capacity versus that price and the cycles versus that price. And that works out to having four lines, which is a four-dimensional problem. And the way we look at it in my book, Hypernomics, using hidden dimensions to solve unseen problems, available in all fine bookstores, and also on Amazon. It decides to go down to the South Pole because you go to the South Pole and it's called 90 degrees south. But if we called that zero, every point away from that point is positive because there's no
Hmm.
negative geography. And it turns out that in economics, we're all making decisions in positive directions. And so that's the crucial insight is that you can have negative numbers in economics, but you're only comparing one non-negative number to another non-negative number. There are no absolute negatives in economics, and that's the insight that allows all this other stuff to kind of flow out of it. So when you're talking about string theory having 16 dimensions, I gave a paper last year as part of my book where I came up with a system that shows how to plot 16 dimensions at one time. And it's not hypothetical either. It actually takes real data from the market and cramps it all together in a single view.
Well, yeah, yeah, and I hadn't thought about it in years, but I was even thinking. So I was thinking back all the way back to my dissertation. So
Yeah, right.
years and years ago, my PhDs in international political economy, international
Uh-huh.
sociology,
Right.
and I conceived of it was one of these kind of flash inspirational moments, perhaps similar to like what you had in the store with your wife. And I and
Mm-hmm.
I'm and I envision like how to map out, this model. And as I put it down, I realized, oh, this is actually like a 5D model.
Right.
And I did it, and I went about and I did all my stuff and I did all my statistics and I did all these different things, and I defended my dissertation. And I had the trickiest time though, trying to like publish, in academic journals one piece of this one piece of this research in particular, because every time I went to a journal with this particular model, their critique was, this is too complicated. Like,
Yeah.
you got to stick to like 3D because
Right.
it's too confusing. Anyways, that's neither here nor there, but it's just it's interesting that as we're creatures of comfort, and
Right.
as humans, that's how our minds function, right? And so
Right.
it's no wonder that that's what we tend back to. But there's so much more potential to think about really complex issues in more depth and nuance, and as we start to consider all the different complicating factors that lead into what's contributing to various issues, right? And so
Absolutely.
what you're doing is just part of that. So anyways, I applaud that effort.
Yeah, that's exactly right, John. That what we're trying to do here is to give you more ways to look at the same problem so that you can solve it better. And when I first came up with this idea and I actually plotted it, because it is complicated, and back to what your journal editors were saying to you, I didn't understand it at first, and then it took me a while to understand that, there's a thing, just there's a a construct where everything is positive. Geography is always positive. There's no negative geography. If you just start at a point, everything is positive from a point. And that's how I managed to get my arms wrapped around this problem. And so what it can do for you is it can solve, for example, the limit to a certain market. So for example, there's a whole bunch of dots that form that represent the quantities supplied and the price for, say, business aircraft. And there's a limit for these dots that forms. If you take that limit and you track it over time, you'll discover that there's only so much that the market can absorb at a certain time. And so when a company up north of us, west of you in Reno,
Hmm.
a company called Arion just wanted to build a supersonic business jet, and they put $1 billion into this thing, and it didn't sell. And I predicted it would go bankrupt before it did. And the way I was able to do that was to note that it was beyond what the market was going to be able to support. It
Yeah.
was picking a price quantity point that was well beyond the boundary that the market had, and that turns out to be something that's relatively straightforward to be able to do with hypernomics. It's harder to do it with hypothetical constructs that you get in traditional economics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you started to, go into how this can be helpful, but let's explore more about, decision making. So as we
Hmm.
understand markets, as we can get beyond perhaps the simple models. And let me preface this by saying, it's good to have simple, straightforward models.
Sure.
Models help us to make sense of a complex, messy world, right? And so
Hmm.
so to have traditional, simple economic models is useful. It is helpful. But to be able to take models that are a little bit more complex, how can we leverage these? How can we leverage hypernomics as we're trying to make more, better decision making as we're, running our businesses?
Well, the first thing you do with hypernomics, which I do to reduce the problem so that somebody can see it, is I take 2D shots of the multidimensional stuff that's going on so that people can get the idea broken down in their head a little bit better. So people can understand a limit for me, and you can understand being beyond that limit. And that's the 2D aspect of what's going on. The other thing that you can do when you take the data and you kind of just flop it onto a 2D surface is you can see the boundaries within a market relative to the parameters that they've had. So in the case of a washing machine, the washing machines in a house can only be so big, so they're limited by size, and they only can have
Mhm.
so many cycles because it doesn't make any more sense. But there's a certain limit to the how much somebody's going to be able to pay for something relative to the capacity that it might have. And so this allows you to plot all the points in a market. And so, for example, you could plot capacity versus price, and you could see if there's a gap in the market, and that might tell you to offer the market something that it doesn't have, namely something in that gap that satisfies the customer, giving them something that they don't have now and they might want. So there might be a gap between, say, a 3 or 4 cubic foot tank and a 5 cubic foot tank in a washing machine. And so if there were nobody playing in that field and you could get something into a house that would fit that, well, maybe that's what you want to put into it. And that's what this modeling lets you do is it lets you find that open space. It's kind of like when you're
Yeah.
trying to buy say a McDonald's franchise. You could put the McDonald's franchise right next to another McDonald's franchise, or you could try to go to the part of the city that doesn't have any and it's got enough population to support it. You want to have an opening for your physical location that's away from other physical locations. And this is the same thing with the market. You want an opening for your market location that's away from other points in the market.
Yeah. And we're talking about, how this could apply to manufacturing, maybe financial markets.
Yes.
Also we could consider this in relation to labor markets, of other considerations, right? Like there's a lot of different ways to apply this and to consider this. And I think for me, one of the key takeaways here is again to just remind people that
Mm-hmm.
while perhaps more simplistic models are useful, they're useful to make sense of a messy, complicated world, that we can do better. Like we can tap into other types of more complex decision making models that will help us make better decisions. Multidimensional models can help us to do that. So you explore that in your book. Uh, as we leverage, say, for example, hypernomics
Right.
enhance our strategy to have a competitive edge. How do you see this evolving into the future?
Well, I see it becoming a first to college course, maybe a first to college, maybe a section of a college course, then becoming a college course, and eventually becoming a subdiscipline, and eventually becoming its own entity. There's a lot of stuff to hypernomics that lends itself to becoming an entire discipline in which people can get degrees. So I see it growing in academia through that realm. And then I see it becoming more widespread in business for people to make business decisions, both business and government. So, for example, one of the things that I discovered using this is that the market for missiles is also governed by hypernomics.
Hmm.
And Lockheed Martin and the government decided to make this, that's been in the news lately, one of these hypersonic weapons you may have heard of. Russia's trying to use them on Ukraine. And one of the things that people do with this is they sometimes make the missiles very, very big to make them so they have a really long range. So as long as they
Right.
keep fuel into it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so Lockheed made a missile that was cost 42 million bucks for the first one, and they thought they could sell. The Congressional Budget Office said they could sell 100 of these guys at 15 million 18 million a pop. Well, it turns out that there's a limit to this market, like there is for anything else. And there were 108 standard deviations past that limit, which in yeah, so you know the statistics. It means there was very much less than 1 in a trillion chance that this could happen. All of which could have been avoided. I had somebody ask me just last week. Well, I said, "Well, you're really good on postmortems." I go, "This is a premortem. I told them this back in 2016. I first came up with this paper, and then they just canceled this missile that they started in 2016, 2017 last year. But this is something you can tell in advance in any market if you do enough work. And so that's the whole point of it, is it tells you what to do. And it also can connect markets. So if you get into the book, because all markets share a price axis and just one market has a 4D system, you take an adjacent market and it's got its price axis 4 plus 4, because they have the same price axis, forms a 7D market. And so I did a paper last year in which I showed how the Boeing 787 was up against its demand frontier, and one of its engines was also against its demand frontier, which meant that if both companies, if the engine manufacturer and the airframe manufacturer both dropped their price, as long as the price drop would have still exceeded their cost, they both could have made more money.
Mhm.
And this tells you how to work with your partners, your suppliers, or your people that buy from you, so that it's a completely interactive kind of thing that breaks down into a simple decision. If I drop my price by this much, I stand to sell this many more. What's my cost differential? So it gives you this. The 7D model breaks down into two-dimensional models, one for the airframer, in this case Boeing, and one for the engine manufacturer.
Yeah, yeah. So again, doing that analysis, you mentioned it, post-mortem versus pre-mortem, right? So
Right. Yeah.
analysis before making decisions, before
Right.
investing.
Before it dies. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes a whole lot of sense. And companies invest a lot into, financial projections, into trying to better understand these sorts of investments, right? So it kind of
Hmm.
blows my mind when Lockheed makes that kind of a bungle,
Yes. Right.
when they're completely off like that.
Exactly. So one point they basically took $1.3 billion and lit it on fire because that missile's going nowhere. Nobody can afford to use that missile.
Hmm.
You know,
And,
it's
how do you think that happens? Like, why do you think that happens?
I
Because
think it's because people
there's
don't
plenty of
understand
really
what
smart people at Lockheed Martin.
they're brilliant people at Lockheed Martin. I worked there for 31 years. So I worked in the Skunk Works, their premier design facility, for 31 years, and I was the program manager for manufacturing on the F-117A, the stealth fighter. And lots of brilliant people there. But what happens often in aerospace is people like bright, shiny objects that go real fast. And so this missile was bright and shiny. It went Mach 7 or whatever the end speed was going to be. So check, check, check. If we build it, they will come. Well,
Yeah,
no, they'll build it if they can afford it. And you
yeah.
didn't bother to check out to see if they could afford it before you built it. And so what happens here is these are uncharted waters. And so what's going to be, I think it's exciting for potential students of hypernomics, is that you take this new discipline and you run it against your industry. And if you're one of the first people in your industry to use this, You are an economic explorer. You are an explorer using hypernomics to figure out things in your market nobody's ever bothered to figure out. And all it takes is, a lot of good data. You can't cast it one way or the other. You got to take the right data, and you take the data over time so you can see the trends. So if you take a 4D model, and you add time, it becomes a 5D model. And so what you want to do is take enough data and take enough time, and you can march forward into solving the problem. And that's kind of what this is designed to do. Is designed to solve problems that you couldn't see, you couldn't break down without the added dimensions. So this helps you break the problem down with the added dimensions.
Yeah, and as you're describing that, I'm also thinking about the book in the movie Moneyball. I don't know if you're familiar
Yes. Oh yeah, I
with
love Moneyball. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
great movie, great book. And I'm thinking, the application of economics into baseball operations, right, and decision
Right.
making. And I'm thinking, again, you look at some of I'm blanking on the guy's name. James was the guy's name from like the 80s and 70s that they based, some of the
Oh, Bill
stuff off
James.
of.
Yeah, Bill James.
Anyways, it was pretty simple though, like pretty simplistic calculations. That they started to apply into the sporting world, and so again, you start to build off of that. You start to build off of that and start to say, okay, now we can use more complex analytics, more complex
Right. Hmm.
predictive approaches, and it can really change the game. And so I start to think about like how could this impact sports and baseball, basketball, football, whatever. And sky's the limit, right?
So it's funny you should say about sports. One of the things that we discovered, somebody asked me, "Can you apply it to sports?" And I said, "Well, let's try." So I took a bunch of data from the NFL wide receivers. And I discovered that, now what happens is there's a whole bunch of noise that happens after the draft, and people are stuck in the 3 and 4 year contracts.
Mhm.
And so sometimes you're not, if you got drafted really low and you perform really well, that doesn't really, your pay doesn't match what your skill levels been, your demonstrated skills have been. So what I did was I took the players that had been in the league for 4 or more years. So I took a bunch of 26-year-old wide receivers, and I said, I said, suppose you caught 4 balls a game and you made a certain number of touchdowns per year. No, yeah, four catches per game. And there was one other parameter. And then I said, what's the difference if your speed is the slowest in the league versus going 0.25 seconds slower? So the slowest guy was about 4.65 for the 40-yard dash. And the
Mhm.
fastest guy back then, this is before they had the cheetah out there, somebody's doing a 4.4.
Yeah.
What happens if you go a quarter second faster? Well, it turns out with the same number of catches and the same number of yards per game that you would have gotten if you were at the low end of the speed thing, you improved your speed from 4.65 to 4.4, that you would have gotten another $630,000. And so what this is telling people is like, and then there's ways to improve your speed. There's a bunch of athletic researchers that figured out how to improve speed, jumping, bursting, doing explosive movements, heavy squats. There's a whole bunch of ways to improve speed. And so what this is telling high school and college and would-be NFL players, hey, if you want to get more money and if you're good enough to get into the NFL, here's what you need to do to get yourself some extra hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so it does work in the NFL. We've already applied it in that realm and got some pretty good answers for it. So
Yeah.
it's something I
Yeah.
wish I'd known when I was playing high school receiver back in the 70s. I mean, I hadn't done at that point heavy weightlifting. And had I done that, my speed would have improved. I could have had a faster 40. I would have drawn more attention to myself. And, at that time, I was thinking of playing college ball. I had some Division II offers, but I wanted to play Division I, and nobody came after me.
Hmm.
Had I known what I had, the whole thing, had I known then what I know now, and done the necessary work, I probably dropped my 40 time from 4.9 to say 4.7.
Right.
Completely improbable possibility here, and then drawn some more attention to myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is just a fascinating conversation. We've only scratched the surface, but you have a book, you have resources that the audience can tap into to learn a
Hmm.
lot more. As we wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, where they can find your book, etc., and then give us the
Okay.
final word for today.
Okay, great. Sure. You can go to my company website, Hypernomics, Hypernomics.com, to figure out what the company's doing. We have software. We have the world's first 4D software that we patented over there. And you can go to my personal website, doughowarth.com, and find out, my lectures. I also give keynote presentations. Just started into that. And find my book on Amazon or Barnes& and Noble. Again, the book's name is Hypernomics, Using Hidden Dimensions to Solve Unseen Problems. But you just put Hypernomics or Doug Howarth in Amazon, that my name will pop up.
Perfect. Doug, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage
Thank
the
you,
audience
John.
to reach out, to get connected, find out more about what Doug can do for you. Check out the book. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.